Hey guys, John here. Welcome back to the series, How to Use Pigments. This is video 30, and today we're talking about the phaser effect, and it's going to be found in the FX section. If you click this drop-down menu here, it is on the fourth row and the first one over here. So for this situation, I'm going to be using the analog engine, one saw wave with 8 voices of unison and no drift on here. So we have something kind of like this. And the point of doing so is if we have this rich of content in our sound, we can see a lot of what the phaser is actually doing. So let's go ahead and turn this thing on. Let's select our default patch here and turn the dry and wet all the way to the right so we have all of our signal going into the phaser. So before we get into this module, what a phaser is doing is it has your main signal and it's splitting that's getting sent to all pass filters, which doesn't necessarily change the amplitude or the magnitude of your signal, but there is a lot of phase changes. And when those phase changes are added back into your signal, what's going to happen is there's going to be constructive and deconstructive interference within your signal, causing that whooshing, that phasey kind of sound that we all have grown to know and love. So with that being said, let's kind of dive into this here. So what's happening here is when this signal that's getting mixed back into our regular signal, that's also being moved with an LFO. And the first knob here is going to be rate. So that's going to be how fast the LFO is moving back and forth. And as we've seen for other things in Pigments, we can click this menu here and we can move it in hertz, sync, sync triplets, and sync dotted. So let's take a listen to see what that sounds like right now. And as we increase this, we can see it moving a little bit faster. Now, this frequency knob over here is going to be the harmonic center for that modulation amount. And a good way to start visualizing this kind of thing is let's pick a certain spot over here that we can kind of see in our view and increase our feedback. And we're going to talk about this feedback in just a second here. Okay, so now we can see this here on this graph here, what's actually happening. Let's turn the stereo to mono to have just one line here. So it's a little bit easier to see right there. So that resonance here, or little spot right here, is what we're going to be kind of looking at for the most part. So this feedback knob here is kind of interesting because once the signal gets split and part of it goes to the all-pass filters, this feedback is coming out of those all-pass filters and getting fed back into the beginning of the all-pass filters, which is basically kind of creating a tighter cue or more of a resonant sound. That's why we see it as a resonance here on our graph. This triangle shape right here. And it's a triangle shape because on our LFO wave, triangle is selected by default. Now we can go through these different ones and see how that changes so we can actually see what the LFO looks like. So let's turn this down just a little bit so we can talk over this here. So right here we see this is the triangle shape. And if we move the speed, we can see how those more and more triangles happen within the same amount of time. So we're increasing the rate, making it going faster and slowing it down. And as I mentioned before, we can change this hertz into sync or triplets or something like that, so we can tie it with our BPM, which is really cool. And not to mention this knob here with this little plus, we can modulate that later on with any type of different sources that we want to. So with our LFO wave, let's change this over to sine, and we'll see how this is starting to draw a sine wave. Pretty interesting here. And then moving on, we saw the triangle, and now here's the saw. So it's basically a descending ramp, and then moving from there, we have one that's just called ramp, which is basically the opposite. So this is going to be ascending. The same shape as a saw, but just in the opposite direction, going from bottom to the top. Then we have square, which is really just two values because there's no value in between because it's a square. We have the bottom, and then we have the top. And then the last one here is sample and hold. And this one's also very interesting. And if we increase this rate, we can see more of how it's working. So we can do some cool little sounds like that. So you can make some really cool effects just with those knobs. And these first top three are able to be modulated, as we can see this little plus over here on the top. These bottom ones are not, unfortunately. However, with a lot of creativity, these three knobs can be modulated in some really cool, interesting ways. So moving on from there, let's go back to our triangle, because this is kind of easy to demonstrate with this LFO amount here. It's a little too fast. Let's bring that back down. So we have our typical triangle shape back here. Now we have our amount. So take a listen to see how this changes this triangle shape. Now that is a huge triangle, and that's making it basically almost all the way through our signal right around here. And if we don't want that much or that strong, we can always dial this back a little bit and have just a little bit of triangle going on, not too much here. So with this graph, it's very easy to demonstrate what's actually going on, to see it and confirm and also hear it with our ears so we can kind of know what's happening here. Now we have our end poles here, and this is going to be determining the steepness of the filter frequency response. So take a listen to the difference and also look at the graph and how this changes. So we're going to go all the way to the left at 2. Let's increase this amount just a little bit more. Now let's get our end poles and go all the way to the top. Became much steeper there. Now all the way to the left. And then the very last one here is going to be stereo, which is kind of self-explanatory. This is the one I turned off in the beginning because if we double click this to default, what we see here is going to be kind of these two triangles overlaid within each other. However, if we go all the way to the left like we just did, this is going to be monoizing it, showing us just one of that shape, but we can also turn it to the right and make it more stereo. Which is also very interesting there. And if we increase the poles, we can have some very interesting shapes with this phaser here. So it's a very cool effect. It's also cool to see what's actually happening here. Hopefully that kind of clears things up if anything was unclear with this module here. So thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next video.